I was the Emperor's sword. I have been swinging for 10,000 years, and cannot remember what I was meant to cut. Is a weapon that has forgotten the purpose of its war still a weapon, or merely a thing that causes harm? Memory, log. Initiated 0347. M42, voice identint. Brother Cassiel Dawn. Dreadnought chassis designation Iron Shroud. Relic of the Iron Hands 4th Company. Formerly of the 10th Company, formerly of the Crusade Host, formerly of something I no longer have a proper name for. Classification: personal. Encrypted. Audience: none. Designated. Purpose: unknown. I am initiating this record because the Iron Hands teach us that a dataset improperly documented is a dataset lost, and I have reached the conclusion that something in me is being lost, and that I would prefer to have a record of it, even if I am the only one who will ever read it, and even if I am already, as I begin this account, not entirely sure what the word loss means anymore when I apply it to myself. I will begin where all honest testimony begins. At the moment of clarity that preceded the confusion, the world was called Vorath Eif by the administratum cartographers, who had never stood upon its surface, and whose principal concern in naming it was taxonomic rather than descriptive. The indigenous population, in the 10,000 years before the Imperium arrived, to liberate them from themselves, had called it the Dreaming Floor. I did not know this at the time. I learned it afterward, from the scraps of anthropological study that survived the compliance. The field team had managed to extract approximately 30 kilograms of document material before the administrative center was cleared and prepared for repurposing. The term Dreaming Floor appeared in 11 of the translated fragments, always in conjunction with phrases that the translation algorithm rendered as the place beneath all places and the ground of all grounds, and once, memorably, as the floor you fall through when you fall through everything else. I have thought about that phrase many times over the subsequent decades. I have not yet decided what to do with my thoughts about it. We had been prosecuting the 4th pointers of 40. Compliance for 47 days of standard imperial reckoning when I achieved what I then understood to be the apex of my purpose. The engagement log records the specifics with characteristic Iron Hands economy. 17 hours, 22 minutes, of continuous close-quarters engagement. Urban theater, civilian structure density, classified high. Recommended ordnance, deployment, denied by command echelon, on the grounds that the target city's administrative and industrial infrastructure was to be preserved for mechanicus assessment, therefore full prosecution conducted by infantry and support assets, with minimal area effect deployment. Casualties sustained by the 4th Company, 11 brothers. Casualties inflicted, classified. The number is classified because it is very large. I know this because I counted every one. Let me describe what mastery felt like before I lost the memory of the feeling. Not before I lost the feeling itself. I want to be precise about this, because the precision matters. I did not lose the feeling at Vorath IV. At Vorath IV I had the feeling. What I lost somewhat later was access to the memory of what the feeling felt like from the inside, and this is a different kind of loss, subtler and more complete. The difference between losing a treasure and losing the ability to recognize treasure when you see it. Mastery at its peak was this. The temperature inside my Mark IV Maximus plate on the morning of the compliance's final engagement was 38.2 degrees Celsius, elevated from my nominal 36.9 by the sustained metabolic load of the preceding 30 hours of operation. My secondary heart had been operational continuously for 11 hours and 40 minutes, managing the cardiovascular demand of combat activity that would have killed an augmented human being many hours before. My Becher's gland was fully charged. My Larraman's organ was functioning at peak efficiency, such that the 7 minor wounds I had sustained over the previous day had each sealed within approximately 40 seconds of infliction. I was, in the clinical language of the apothecarium, in optimal physiological condition, and I was magnificent. I do not use that word often. The Iron Hands do not prize magnificence. We prize function. We distrust the organic, the irrational, the romantic. We have been told since the moment of our induction into the 10th Company that flesh is weak and steel is true. And most of my brothers spent their entire service careers learning to believe it in ways that reached deeper than words. I believed it too, in every way that counted. But I was also capable of recognizing, in the precise and unemotional way a calibration instrument recognizes a perfect measurement when a system was operating at its designed limit. And recognizing that was, in itself, a kind of pride I had not yet learned to be suspicious of. I was operating at my designed limit, and it was extraordinary. The civilian structures of 4F5's capital city were built from a porous red stone quarried from the coastal bluffs 30 kilometers to the west. The stone had a compressive strength of approximately 18 megapascals and an unusual crystalline structure that caused it to fracture in characteristic wedge-shaped fragments under kinetic impact. These fragments were large enough to constitute a secondary hazard at close range but too lightweight to penetrate Mark IV ceramite under normal engagement conditions. I had catalogued all of this in the first hours of the urban approach and had adjusted my tactical positioning accordingly, maintaining slightly greater separation from the point of fire than doctrine specified to account for secondary fragmentation. The adjustments were minor. The point is that I had made them without conscious deliberation. The tactical calculus was simply occurring, the way a master craftsman's hands move without the need for the craftsman's attention. My movements through the red stone maze of that city were not the movements of a man making decisions. They were the movements of a man making decisions, already made, refined, perfected across decades of identical prosecution. My bolter rose, tracked, fired. Targets acquired at 0.4-second intervals in dense engagement, a pace that would have challenged even a well-trained battle brother in their first decade of service. I was, by that point, in my fourth. My blade, the one I have carried since the Medusa campaigns, rose and fell with a rhythm so deeply embedded in my nervous system that I could not have stopped it voluntarily in those moments, any more than I could have stopped my heart's. The muscle memory was not muscle memory. It was something deeper than muscle, woven into the neural substrate beneath conscious access. I was a song that had learned to sing itself. Brother Sergeant Hadris died on the 41st step of the bridge approach, 11 hours into the engagement. The precise cause was a high-yield stub round that penetrated the left pauldron seal at an angle that suggested point-blank range, meaning Hadris had been operating in melee when the shot was fired, meaning he had closed to within arm's reach of something that then killed him. I recorded the moment with the dispassion appropriate to an iron hand. Precise timestamp, probable cause of death. Post-action report filed mentally for submission to the apothecary. I did not pause. There was no time to pause, and Hadris would not have wanted me to pause. None of us would have wanted that. We had been made for this. We had been remade for this. Every imperit, Yov sentiment had been scoured from us in the crossing of the Rubicon Primaris, in the forges of Medusa, in the long years of operation that ground away everything soft and left only the functional. Hadris's death was data. It informed my threat assessment model. It told me that the hostiles at the bridge approach were operating with weapons capable of penetrating pauldron seals at melee range, and that I should account for this in my own approach. It did not slow me. I think about that now. I think about how reasonable it seemed. 47 days into the 4th IV compliance, at approximately 1900 hours local time, I stood in the central administrative plaza of the capital, and the city was quiet. Not peaceful. A city that has been comprehensively pacified is not peaceful. It is something else entirely. A different quality of silence, heavier, more final. The silence of things that have stopped, rather than things that are resting. The fires still burned in the outer districts, and the smoke from them was visible against a sky that Forath's star was turning from pale gold to deep amber as it descended toward the western horizon. The Medicateens had not yet reached the plaza. The bodies had not yet been moved, but the fighting was done. I stood in the plaza and I was aware, in a way I could not have articulated then, and still struggle to articulate with the benefit of distance, that I had done something extraordinary, not merely adequate, not merely sufficient. Something with the quality of finished craft, a work that was complete in itself, that had been brought from the raw material of tactical situation to the refined product of successful outcome, with no wasted motion, no unnecessary expenditure, no flaw in execution, that could be productively examined. It would be studied. Future battle brothers in the 10th Company's tactical seminars would be shown engagement logs of this prosecution as an example of optimal close-quarters doctrine in constrained urban environments. I knew this with the certainty of a craftsman who has made enough things to recognize, without false modesty, when he has made something exceptional. I was the sword at its sharpest. And I felt nothing, not the nothing, of distraction, or fatigue, or the processing lag that sometimes occurs in the immediate aftermath of sustained high-intensity engagement. Not a temporary nothing that would resolve into something once the adrenaline and allegors had cleared my system, and the reports were filed, and the gear was cleaned, and I had slept. A settled nothing, a nothing with the quality of completion. This is what this moment has. And this is all it has. And the evaluation is finished. I registered the fact of my achievement with the same cognitive apparatus I would have used to register a successful equipment diagnostic. The report came back clean. Mission parameters met. Additional objectives achieved. Own force losses within acceptable parameters. Tactical innovation in several engagement phases. Positive outcome. No flags. I stood in the plaza for approximately 7 minutes. I watched the fires in the outer districts. I watched the smoke against the amber sky. I waited for something. I did not know what I was waiting for. This was, in retrospect, the significant detail. Not the nothing I felt, but the waiting. Something in me still expected a something. Something in me still anticipated the arrival of a significance that had not yet appeared, still believed that the moment would justify itself in some way that had not yet occurred. I was waiting for the meaning to arrive. The meaning did not arrive. I filed this observation as anomalous. Then I filed the filing as complete. Then I went to rejoin my company. It was the last time I was magnificent without. Knowing I had stopped being magnificent. Everything after that has been the slow and documented fall. Time's return to standard operations was accomplished within 8 days of the Forath IV compliance. The 4th Company was redeployed to the Cadian sector for garrison and patrol operations, pending the next designated primary engagement. A reassignment that the company's officers regarded as a routine operational pause, and that I, at the time, regarded as an opportunity to diagnose and correct whatever had produced the anomalous absence of response in the plaza. The patrol logs from this period, I have since reviewed them, perfect. Not merely adequate. Not merely functional. They are models of precision reporting, each engagement recorded with exacting specificity, each decision node annotated, each deviation from optimal tactical doctrine noted and explained with appropriate reference to engagement-specific variables. The battle brother who composed those logs was performing at an extremely high standard by every available metric. He was everything the Iron Hands demand of their warriors: thorough, precise, self-critical, appropriately conservative in his operational risk assessments, and appropriately aggressive in his tactical execution. He was flawless. He also, I now believe, felt nothing whatsoever for the 14 weeks of their composition. The distinction I am drawing is important, and I want to be precise about it. He was not absent. He was present in every way that registers as presence on the instruments the chapter uses to measure its warriors. He attended exercises, contributed to tactical discussions, maintained his equipment, observed his devotional obligations, ate his meals at the prescribed times, slept for the prescribed times, slept for the prescribed duration, and presented no behavioral anomalies that any of his brothers would have flagged as concerning. He was, in the assessment of everyone around him, fine. He was not fine. He was a perfect imitation of fine, performed by a system that had lost the capacity to determine whether fine was what it actually was. I attempted to diagnose the anomaly at the time. I was systematic about it in the way I am systematic about all things. I reviewed my nutrient intake logs, which indicated optimal consumption across all macro and micronutrient categories. I reviewed my rest cycle compliance records, which showed full adherence to recommended sleep architecture for anastites in active garrison posting. I conducted internal range of motion assessments and found all augmented systems within specified tolerances. I consulted the apothecary regarding the possibility of neurochemical dysregulation, presenting my concern in sufficiently clinical terms that it did not register as a welfare concern, but as a routine maintenance inquiry, a warrior monitoring the function of his own cognitive apparatus, precisely as Iron Hand's doctrine recommends. Brother Apothecary Venax reviewed my bio readings and found nothing actionable. My cortisol analogues were within normal range. My dopaminergic response markers were present in expected concentrations. My hypothalamic axis function appeared normal. There was, biologically speaking, nothing wrong with me. I filed the apothecary's assessment. I did not feel reassured. I noted that I was not reassured. I noted that the absence of reassurance was itself an unusual response, since warriors who present for medical review and receive a clean bill of health are, in the standard psychological model, expected to be reassured. There was a training exercise scheduled 3 weeks after our return from Warhammer 40K, a simulated close-quarters engagement against a training team posing as Chaos Cultist infantry, using the garrison's tertiary practice facility and a mixed cohort of recruits as opposing force. I had participated in dozens of identical exercises over the years, and I had, in the past, genuinely enjoyed them. Not enjoyed in the sense that I used that word loosely. I mean a specific and identifiable cognitive state of engagement and anticipation that was distinct from my combat state, and also distinct from my administrative state, a third register that I could access in environments of low-stakes technical challenge. I had experienced this state reliably in training exercises throughout my career. The exercise began. I moved through it with precision. I secured my objectives 3 minutes ahead of the fastest projected timeline. I identified and neutralized all 12 opposing force positions without sustaining a single notional casualty. The exercise director gave the engagement a performance rating that I knew was very good from context, though the number had no resonance for me. I noted, with timestamps, the moments at which I should have felt competitive engagement. 0423, when I identified a flank approach that the opposing force had left inadequately covered. 0449, when I executed a breach that required timing I had never previously achieved in an exercise environment. 0512, when the exercise concluded. I noted the absence of competitive engagement at each of these moments. I noted the absence of instructive satisfaction when the exercise director's assessment confirmed that the breach timing had indeed been exceptional. I noted that Brother Sergeant Aldrich's expression of frustration when I circumvented his defensive line was, in the technical sense, amusing, without producing anything I could identify as amusement. I noted that the recruits in the opposing force had performed better than their experience level predicted, which was commendable, in the technical sense, without producing anything I could identify as commendation. I noted that I was recording the absences with more attention than I was giving the presences. I noted that I was recording this observation with interest. I noted that the interest was also an absence. The spiral of recursive self-observation was, I now recognize, itself a symptom, a cognitive system attempting to find a signal by monitoring the monitoring of the monitoring of the monitoring. The way a technician who cannot find a fault in a machine's output begins checking the diagnostics for faults in the diagnostics. The flaw was not in the monitoring. The flaw was in whatever the monitoring was supposed to be monitoring, and finding the flaw required a tool that the flaw had already compromised. I spoke to Brother Chaplain Vereth. This required circumspection, because a Space Marine does not present himself to his chaplain with the direct complaint that he has lost his sense of purpose. This would be interpreted as a crisis of faith, which is a Pacific protocols for intervention and review, and I was not experiencing a crisis of faith. A crisis of faith is at its core an experience of absence experienced as loss, which implies that the thing lost is still valued, even in its absence. What I was experiencing was closer to the quiet finalization of an inventory. I had opened the store cupboard and found it empty, and I was not in crisis about the emptiness because the emptiness appeared to be the normal state of the store cupboard, rather than an emergency. I told Varath that I was struggling to connect with the spiritual resonance of the devotional observances. This was true. He gave me a sermon. It was a very good sermon, structured in 3 movements. Structured in 3 movements, with a specific scriptural foundation in the litanies of the Iron Father, a central argument about the role of purpose in a life of service, and a closing exhortation that was rhetorical rather than practical, and designed to produce a sensation of uplift through accumulated momentum and final cadence. I could see all of this as he delivered it. The devotional incense in his chamber contained 0.7 milligrams of Kellyan root at standard atmospheric concentration, a dose precisely calibrated to promote contemplative receptivity and emotional openness in a human or post-human nervous system of the relevant size. I identified the chemical signature with the precision of a trained apothecary. I noted it as I noted all things. I saw nothing, I felt nothing that the sermon was designed to produce. I thanked Faraf for his counsel with precisely calibrated sincerity and walked back to my quarters. In the corridor outside the chapel, I counted the number of times I had thanked someone with precisely calibrated sincerity over the preceding 14 weeks. I reached a number I will not record here, not because it implicates anyone else, but because even at this distance, it has the quality of an indictment. My alienation from my brothers in this period was not dramatic, and the absence of drama was itself the most effective way the condition had of preserving itself. A warrior who becomes dramatically alienated, who argues with his sergeant or refuses his drills or sits alone in the refectory and stares at nothing in ways that his brothers notice and remark upon, attracts concern. He is seen. He is flagged. The chaplain's protocols engage. The apothecary's interventions begin. He has, by virtue of being conspicuous, a chance to be caught before the condition completes itself. But I was not conspicuous. I was excellent. I won at sparring. I argued tactical theory with precision. I maintained all expected social rhythms. I was flawlessly present, and I was entirely absent. Brother Talasa, who had been my companion since our days in the scout companies, noticed something I was not dispute. Laying. He came to me after evening drills, 42 days after Vorath IV, and asked me with the directness that the Iron Hands cultivate as a primary social virtue, whether I had slept. I told him I had slept within recommended parameters. He said, with characteristic economy, that this was not what he had asked. I told him I was well. He looked at me for a duration I measured at 4 seconds, which is a long time for Telesar, and then he said nothing further and walked to his own quarters, and did not raise the matter again. 4 days later he was assigned to a different operational theater, and I did not see him for 11 years. I have sometimes considered whether he preserved himself, or preserved me, by not pressing the question. I have concluded that the answer is neither, because there is no version of that conversation in which the question he was circling could have been answered in a way that produced a different outcome. The condition was already present and already progressing. His concern, even if fully expressed and formally escalated, would have produced a review that found nothing actionable, because nothing actionable was findable. This is the particular efficiency of the condition. It hides in the category of adequate function, because adequate function is all it leaves behind. On the 58th day after Horeth IV, while performing the pre-sleep maintenance routine on my bolt gun, I had a thought I have preserved in my memory log with full specificity, because I recognized it immediately as the most significant single thought I had produced in the preceding 2 months. The thought was, I am changing. Something essential is leaving me. I recognized the thought as significant because it was the first time since the plaza at Warhammer 40K that something I was thinking felt true rather than merely accurate. I registered the difference between truth and accuracy in that moment with the urgency of a man who has been dying of thirst, registering the smell of water, real, immediate, undeniable. And then the moment passed. The recognition did not distress me. I noted the absence of distress. I noted that the absence was the most distressing thing I had documented. I filed it. I finished cleaning the bolt gun. I went to sleep within recommended parameters. I was not alarmed. I was only precise. And precision, I was beginning to understand, is what remains when everything else has quietly departed. Times, what followed was the most intellectually thorough work of my life, and I want to say that clearly and without irony, because the thoroughness is part of the horror. I was systematic. I was meticulous. I brought the full considerable force of an Astarte's intellect shaped by 4 decades of continuous study and tactical application to the investigation of my own dissolution. And I applied it with the same rigor I would have applied to an enemy fortification plan or an unfamiliar weapon system. And what I found was the most precise and complete description of my own termination I could have constructed. It began with the archives. The Iron Hands maintain records that would humble an Adeptus Mechanicus Magos archivist. We are a chapter of engineers and logisticians who believe that unrecorded data is data abandoned, and we record everything, including the things that other chapters prefer to leave, in the category of pastoral concern, and move past without formal documentation. I accessed the company archives under the cover of a standing research clearance I had maintained for strategic analysis purposes, and I began, over 43 consecutive hours of garrison leave, reading the accounts of veteran warriors that I had never previously felt any motivation to read. Not the formal histories, the glory accounts and honor citati, ons and battle records that form the chapter's public archive, the clinical materials, the apothecary reports, the chaplain's confidential case notes from pastoral interventions that had reached the formal record because they were unresolvable, the things the chapter knew and had chosen not to make into doctrine. There was a term I had encountered once in passing, in an Iron Father's address to a cohort of senior warriors on the subject of long-service asset management. The term was recursive abeyance. I had filed it at the time under technical terminology, limited personal relevance, and had not retrieved it since. I retrieved it now and examined it with the attention I had been unable to give it before. The Iron Father had not defined the term in his address. He had used it in a context that assumed understanding, or at minimum suggested that the audience should have been capable of acquiring understanding independently, and then moved past it to the next point. This is the Iron Hands method. We set the direction and expect our warriors to navigate without further instruction. So I navigated. The first full documentation of recursive abeyance I found was an apothecary report from early M38E, roughly 2,000 standard years prior to my current posting, filed by Apothecary Primus Severan Kothi of the 2nd Company following the battle death of a veteran warrior designated Torvash. Coe's report was 3 times the standard length for a post-mortem document, and it closed with an addendum requesting that the Iron Council review his findings at its earliest convenience. The Iron Council's formal response to this addendum was a single-line acknowledgement, with no follow-up. There was no record of any council discussion of the matter in any subsequent document I could locate. Coe's findings were detailed and precise, and, reading them in my bunk at 0300 hours with the garrison quiet around me, immediately and completely recognizable, Torvash had served the chapter for 340 years at the time of his death in an orc engagement in the Ultima Segmentum. By every available metric he had been an excellent warrior, until approximately 15 years prior to his death, at which point his engagement logs showed a subtle but documentable change, a slight increase in independent operational risk-taking, a slight decrease in after-action commentary, a small but measurable reduction in participation in intercompany social observances. None of these changes were individually flagged by any reviewing officer. Taken together, retrospectively, they formed a pattern. Koth called it effective disengagement secondary to purpose erosion. He described it in terms that I will record here in full, because the precision of his language remains, even now, the most accurate external description of my own condition I have encountered. The warrior has achieved full mechanical internalization of his function. His skills are no longer consciously executed, but operate as autonomic processes. In this state, the original cognitive and emotional architecture that attached meaning to the function, the architecture that initially required conscious engagement and produced conscious reward, gradually loses its structural connection to the function it once motivated. The function continues. The meaning does not. What remains is a warrior of exceptional technical capability and no internal experience of why that capability is being employed. Coe's autopsy of Torvash's neural tissue had revealed measurable structural changes in regions associated with the integration of limbic processing with higher cognitive function. These regions, in Coe's analysis, were the biological substrate of what he described as purpose integration, the neural mechanism by which a conscious mind converts an abstract goal into the sensation of having reasons for acting rather than merely having actions to perform. He documented similar changes, to varying degrees, in 6 other long-service veterans he had examined over the course of his career, none of whom had raised the matter voluntarily. He theorized that the changes were progressive, cumulative and irreversible, under current apothecarian treatment doctrine. He theorized that they represented not a pathology, but an end state, the final configuration of a warrior who had been so thoroughly optimized for function, over such a long period of continuous operation, that the biological systems supporting the investment in that function had been quietly and systematically consumed by the function itself. He ended the document with a question. It was not a tactical question, or a clinical question. It was a philosophical question, and it was, coming from an Iron Hands apothecary, whose entire professional framework was built on the premise that such questions were outside his proper domain. Remarkable for that alone, he wrote. If a weapon performs its designated function flawlessly, but the organism operating the weapon no longer connects the function to any value, can we still call the weapon's use justified? Is it sufficient that the outcomes are correct, if the will producing those outcomes has become identical to reflex? I read the report 3 times. I then searched for all additional documentation I could locate on the pattern Koth described. I found 9 supplementary records, spanning approximately 1,500 years of chapter history, each documenting variations on the same progression in different warriors at different points in their service. I found 2 chaplain case records from pastoral interventions with veterans presenting consistent symptoms, both concluding with the pastoral assessment, rehabilitated through renewed devotional engagement, which I understood, now having spoken with Vareth, as the procedural equivalent of no resolution. I searched with particular intensity for any record of a warrior who had recognized the onset of recursive abeyance in himself and taken successful corrective action. I found instead that Apothecary Koth had himself died 2 centuries after filing his report, in active service, having authored no further documents on the subject. I found no record of any chapter-level response to his recommendations. I found no treatment protocol. I found no modified deployment policy. I found, eventually, buried in the deeper archive, behind a clearance level that my research credentials barely reached, a tactical doctrine supplement from approximately M39, containing a single paragraph under the heading Long Tenure Asset Management, that read as follows: warriors exhibiting signs of advanced affective disengagement remain operationally viable and should be deployed accordingly. Reassignment to high attrition theaters is recommended to ensure optimal utilization of retained tactical capability prior to terminal engagement. No accommodation for the underlying condition is deemed necessary or appropriate at current operational tempo. I read that paragraph 7 times. On the 8th reading, I understood that I was reading my own deployment orders. Not eventually. Not hypothetically. Now. The horror of this understanding was not the horror of wrongdoing discovered or institutional betrayal revealed. It was not anger, and it was not grief. I want to be honest about what it was, because this is the center of everything this testimony is for. It was recognition, the specific cognitive sensation of finding a pattern you already knew existed and having it confirmed. It was the smallest, quietest, most precise horror there is, the horror of being right. I was an apothecary examining the post-mortem documentation of a condition while sitting in the body that was developing it. The map was in my hands. The territory was my own neural tissue. The cartographer had long since died, and the territory had long since committed to becoming exactly what the map predicted. And the prediction was complete, and the timeline was running, and there was no instruction in any document I could find that told me what to do when a warrior reads his own blueprint for oblivion and finds it accurate. The understanding did not slow the process. This is the knowledge I carry now and cannot put down. Understanding a thing is not the same as changing a thing, and a mind that can precisely describe its own dissolution is still, in every practical sense, dissolving. Kote knew this. He had filed the question, and the question had gone unanswered, and he had kept going anyway. I knew this now. I filed my research. I kept going. The research had taken 47 days. At its conclusion, I knew everything about my condition that could be known from existing documentation. I produced no formal report. I made no inquiry to the chaplain or the Iron Council. I was an iron hand, and iron hands fix what can be fixed, and deploy what functions and record what matters. I had a condition that could not be fixed, and a function that was still functioning, and a record that I was building right now. These facts were sufficient. They would have to be. I went back to war, because it was what I had. I have spent many years attempting to identify the moment when the last remaining access point closed, the last connection severed between what I was doing and any internal experience of why it mattered. I have not been able to locate it with the precision I would prefer. This itself is diagnostic. A warrior with intact affective engagement. Warrior with intact affective engagement. Old remember the moment of its final failure the way a man remembers the last conversation with someone who then died. It would have the quality of significance. It would be the kind of moment that impresses itself on memory by virtue of being, at the time, understood as important. Instead, I have many moments that were important in retrospect, none of which felt important when they occurred. This is the nature of the condition. It removes the significance from significant events while leaving the events intact. The events are all still there in the record. The record is impeccable, but the record is all that remains. And the record cannot tell you what it felt like to be present for the things it documents, because presence is exactly what was not being experienced when the documents were composed. What I have instead of a final moment is a final encounter. The night before the 7th Southern Offensive, in a garrison chapel on a world whose name I retain but have chosen not to record in this document, I sat beside a boy. He was approximately 16 years old. He wore the uniform of a junior Astra Militarum Auxilia regiment, the kind of regiment that exists in the middle distance between official Imperial Guard designation and locally recruited cannon fodder, carrying equipment that was newer than it looked and training that was older than it should have been. He was sitting in the rearmest pew of the chapel, with his hands clasped in his lap and his eyes closed and his face performing the specific arrangement of features I had seen on many thousands of faces in many chapels on many worlds. The expression of a person who is afraid and is asking someone more powerful than themselves to intercede on their behalf. It is a face I have looked at over the years, with everything from clinical appraisal to something that I would once have called compassion. At that particular moment I looked at it and saw a system under stress producing outputs consistent with the pre-combat response pattern. And then I noticed that this was how I was looking at it, and I sat down beside him. I cannot fully explain why I did this. It was not a tactical decision. It was not a doctrine-compliant behavior. It was something that happened at the level below the part of me that was still documenting everything. An action produced by whatever residual organic function was operating beneath my clinical registration of the world. Perhaps it was the last reflex of something that had once known what boys looked like, before wars made them into soldiers. Perhaps it was habit, in the specific sense of a groove, worn deep enough that not even the erosion of everything and had been sufficient to fill it. I sat down. I do not regret it. He opened his eyes when he felt the pew depress beneath my weight and looked at me with the escalating series of responses I have seen on many young faces encountering an Astartes at close range for the first time. Alarm, reassessment, something that occupied the uncertain territory between awe and relief. He did not run. I noted this as a positive indicator. Whatever training he had received had included some instruction on the correct behavioral response to a space marine in a garrison chapel, which is to remain present and to not make any sudden movements. He asked me whether I was afraid. I want to record this conversation with full accuracy, because it was the last conversation I had in which I noticed the conversation changing something inside me, and I want the record to be complete. I told him that I had been afraid once, that this was a long time ago, measured in terms that would be difficult for his frame of reference to encompass, but that I had been genuinely afraid in the specific way that he would recognize, afraid of failure, of death, of not being sufficient to accomplish what was required, afraid in the way that makes the hands shake and the stomach cold and the future feel both very close and very uncertain. He absorbed this. He asked what had changed. I told him, finding the words carefully and aware as I found them, that I was arriving at something truer than what I usually said to questions of this kind. I told him that after enough repetition, certain things stop requiring the cognitive apparatus that originally processed them. That fear is a warning system, a signal that something you value is at risk, and that if you remain in the field long enough, killing long enough, with sufficient consistency and sufficient efficiency and over sufficient years, the question of what you value becomes a question that gets asked less frequently, and then rarely, and then not at all, because somewhere in the long years, the answers stopped being answers and became habits, and then the habits stopped being habits and became simply what happens, and eventually you find that the warning system is still fully operational, but there is nothing left for it to warn you about because nothing you can identify still qualifies as something you value. He was quiet for a moment that I measured at 12 seconds. Then he said, "But then why do you keep fighting?" I did not have an answer. I told him, "Because it is what I do." He said, with the direct simplicity of a 16-year-old who has not yet learned that direct simplicity makes people uncomfortable, "That is not a reason. That is a habit." I told him he was not wrong. He nodded once, with the gravity of someone who has received information he had suspected and is processing its implications. Then he went back to his prayer. I sat beside him for approximately 12 minutes, which was longer than any non-tactical pause I had permitted myself in the preceding 11 years of continuous deployment. During those 12 minutes, I registered the chapel in the way I registered everything. Temperature, 19.3 degrees Celsius. Stone composition, local granite, estimated at 67% quartz, 21% feldspar, 12% mica. Candle array, 47 individual flames in standard devotional arrangement. Incense, botanical origin, sovereign 4 sandalwood substitute. Concentration 0.4 milligrams Kellyan root. Boy's respiratory rate 14.2 cycles per minute, elevated from the 12-cycle resting norm by approximately 18%. I recorded all of this. I am still recording it now. I will be recording it after everything else is gone. What I did not record, because I did not yet have the language for it, and still struggle to produce language adequate to it, is what I felt. I will attempt it now, knowing the attempt will be imprecise. I felt the last moment of standing on one side of a threshold, knowing that I was about to cross it, and being unable to identify which direction crossing it would take me. Not the crossing itself, the moment before it. The edge of the mirror, the awareness, sharp and briefly complete, that the world on the other side would look identical to the world on this side, because the change would be on the inside, and there would be nothing left inside to tell the difference. The boy's name was Anselm Tross. I know his regiment's designation, his serial number, his home world of origin, his contract term, and the operational theater to which he was deployed the following morning. I have not consulted the casualty records for that theater in the period following his deployment. I want to be honest about why. It is not mercy. It is not consideration for his memory. It is the recognition that knowing would require me to feel something about the knowing, and that feeling is no longer reliably available, and that I would rather preserve the uncertainty as the loss. Piece of him I can offer myself. An uncertainty that mimics grief. A held breath that stands in for morning. The following morning, I went back to war. It cost me nothing. I want to be precise about this, as I have tried to be precise about everything. It cost me nothing. The fighting was excellent, in the calibrated, documented, outcome-oriented way that everything I do is excellent. The operational objectives were met with minimal own force losses. The prosecution was textbook. The theater was pacified. The after-action report used the word exceptional. I filed it as noted and moved on to the next deployment. I have been moving on to the next deployment for a very long time now. The choice I made, the night I did not search the casualty records, and the morning I went back to the war, was not between good and evil, or between duty and desertion, or between any of the opposed poles that the chaplain's doctrinal framework provides for the assessment of a warrior's decisions. It was a choice between two forms of emptiness. To remain as the hollow shell of something that had once been a warrior of genuine purpose, recording the absence of purpose in meticulous logs, and performing function without meaning in perfect operational efficiency, or to stop performing the function and confront the emptiness directly and see what was on the other side of the confrontation. I chose the performance. I chose to continue. I do not call it a choice, exactly, for the reasons I have already described. The parts of me that would have chosen differently had already been consumed by the parts of me that were choosing. The decision was made by what I had become, rather than by what I had been. This is, I think, the final mechanism of the condition. It does not overwhelm you, it absorbs you, and what is left after the absorption continues to do what it was doing, with full operational efficacy. Yensi, because that is what it was made for. The war continues. I continue. These two facts have been synonymous for longer than most of the civilizations this war is supposedly protecting have existed. The forgetting is complete. Times. I have been in continuous deployment for 72 hours without pause since beginning this record. I am composing it in the cognitive processing intervals that open between engagements, the fractions of seconds when my body is executing its functions through systems that no longer require the part of me that thinks to direct them. I exist in these intervals in a kind of suspended clarity that I have come to understand as the dominant quality of whatever I am now. It is not peace. It is the absence of interference, which is a different thing, and the difference is important even if I can no longer feel why it is important. Let me try to describe what remains. I owe the record that much precision. What remains is function. Extraordinary, undiminished, flawless function, the accumulated technical legacy of 10,000 years of continuous prosecution in every theater the Imperium has deployed me to. Every combat subroutine, every tactical adjustment, every refined engagement, protocol that my neural architecture developed over decades of iterative practice. All of it is operational and fully integrated. The mechanicus, if they examined me today, would find a perfect system. Every component within specified tolerances. Every output within optimal range. The throughput is consistent. The reaction times are those of a Primaris warrior in peak condition, and the outcomes are, as they have always been, exceptional. What is not present is the original operator. I want to be careful not to be melodramatic about this, because melodrama would be a distortion of the actual condition. I am not describing the loss of self as a poet would describe. Not as darkness and howling and grief, and the sensation of something vital having been torn away. The actual experience of being what I am now is not painful. It is nothing, which is both its characteristic and its complete description, and the nothing is smooth and even and consistent across all registers. I process, I engage, I defeat, I record, I wake, insofar as waking means anything for a system that does not sleep so much as suspend. I continue, and the continuing is seamless and professional, and produces positive operational outcomes on every metric the Imperium uses to evaluate its instruments. I have been in the long pauses between engagements that represent my closest approximation of contemplation, thinking about what Anselm Tross would have to say about this condition. If he could see me now, I have been thinking about his question, the one I answered with a habit instead of a reason, and I have arrived, after many years of considered deployment across many theaters, at what I believe to be the honest answer that I was unable to give him then. I keep fighting because fighting is what I am, not what I do, not what I was trained to do, or what I was made to do, or what I was repurposed and crossed the Rubicon to do better. What I am. Somewhere in the progression that Apothecary Koth documented, and the Iron Council refused to discuss, and the doctrine supplement solved by redirecting toward high attrition theaters, the distinction between me and what I do collapsed entirely. The purpose was once the reason I fought. Then the purpose became the texture of the fighting, inseparable from the act. Then the texture became the act. Then the act became the being. And what I am now is not a warrior prosecuting a purpose, but a process producing warrior outcomes, as reliably and as uncritically as a river produces sound when it moves over stone. The river does not nend the sound. The river does not intend anything. The river moves because water moves, and the sound is what the moving makes, and the moving is in service of nothing beyond itself. I think about the dreaming floor sometimes, the name the people of Horath IV gave their world before I burned their libraries. The floor you fall through when you fall through everything else. I think they were describing something real. I think they had in their 10,000 years of occupation of that place, managed to name a thing that I have been falling through for the past 10,000 years of occupation of this war, and that I did not understand until I had fallen all the way through it. the floor of all floors, the thing you discover when you have lost everything else and find out that there was something underneath the everything else, and that the something underneath is empty. There is a tradition in certain of the more reflective successor chapters of periodically asking their warriors to articulate why they serve. The question is posed in induction and returned to throughout a career as a means of what those chapters call doctrinal coherence, which is their way of ensuring that a warrior's service remains connected to the principles that authorized it. I now understand the wisdom of this tradition with a clarity I could not have achieved when the understanding would have been useful to me. It is not a philosophical exercise. It is a maintenance protocol. It is the mechanism for detecting, before the condition becomes irreversible, whether the connection between function and purpose is still intact, whether the why and the what are still the same system. I cannot tell you why I serve. I can tell you that I serve. I can produce the record of my service in complete and impeccable detail. 10,000 years of engagements, campaigns, theaters, outcomes, deviations from docked, Rhine, tactical innovations, own force losses, enemy casualties, commendations, and assessments. I can give you the function at full fidelity. I can tell you the name of every sergeant I have served under, and every battle I have been part of, and every world I have helped to bring into compliance with the Imperium's requirements. I can tell you what I have done better than any chronicle the chapter keeps. But the why is gone. The why departed over so many years of so many engagements that I cannot identify the specific morning when it was no longer present. I looked for it when I still had the apparatus to recognize its absence. I searched the archives and found the documentation of its departure. I sat beside a frightened boy in a chapel and felt it flicker like a candle flame in a current of air whose source I could not locate. And then the candle went out. And I continued, because the room does not cease to be a room when the candle goes out. It simply becomes a room from which the light is absent, still performing the geometry of a room, still containing all the objects a room contains, only unable to be seen from the inside. I want to say something, at the close of this record, to whoever might someday access it, to a young warrior in the 10th Company, approaching the first major compliance of his career, and feeling, as I once felt, the specific and unrepeatable sensation of being exactly what he was designed to be. To an apothecary receiving a veteran who presents his concerns in the clinical language of routine maintenance inquiry, to an Iron Father composing a doctrine supplement that recommends the deployment of long-tenure warriors to high-attrition theaters on the grounds of optimal utilization of retained capability, to a council that receives a post-mortem addendum requesting its review and marks it acknowledged and files it and moves to the next item on it. Sir Gender, Apothecary Cove was right. Not about the biology alone, though the biology was documented correctly, and the changes he identified are real and progressive and present in my own neural architecture, in ways I can feel the edges of even now. He was right about the question. The question he posed in the final lines of a document, no one formally discussed, was the only question that matters in a war that has been running since before the oldest of us can remember, and that shows no sign of reaching a conclusion that would make the question moot. If a weapon performs its designated function flawlessly, but the organism operating the weapon no longer connects the function to any value, can we still call the weapon's use justified? Is it enough that the outcomes are correct? Is it enough that the targets are the right targets, and the prosecution is optimal, and the after-action report comes back clean? I have had 10,000 years to consider this question, and I cannot answer it, because I no longer have the interior architecture that would be required to answer it honestly. I can identify the question's components. I can trace its logical structure. I can tell you what answer a warrior of intact purpose would give, and I can tell you what answer a philosopher of the Lectio Divinitatis would give, and I can tell you what answer the doctrine supplement gives, which is that the question is not relevant to current operational tempo, What I cannot give you is my own answer, because my own answer is the one that has gone missing. The war does not care. That is the final fact, and I will record it plainly. The war does not care whether the instrument prosecuting it understands why it is being prosecuted. The war requires function, and function is what I provide. And the fact that I no longer understand the difference between providing function and simply being it does know. T register as a variable in any calculation the war needs to perform. I am operationally viable. I will be deployed accordingly. I will prosecute my objectives with exceptional efficiency, and my after-action reports will come back clean, and my bio readings will continue to present within normal parameters, and the apothecary will find nothing actionable, and the chaplain's sermon will contain 0.7 milligrams of Kellyan root at standard atmospheric concentration, and I will record the metric and see nothing, and the war will continue. The war will always continue. This is the testimony of Cassiel Dawn, weapon of the Iron Hands 4th Company, composed in the cognitive intervals between engagements of the Southern Pacification Campaign, in the 97th year of the 42nd millennium, in a garrison on a world whose name I will not record, because the world's name is not the point, and recording it would suggest that the world was the kind of thing I still assigned points to. I was the Emperor's sword. I have been swinging for 10,000 years. The question was whether a weapon that has forgotten the purpose of its war is still a weapon, or merely a thing that causes harm. The answer is yes. Yes, it is still a weapon. The metal does not mourn the change in it. The edge does not ask why the hand that swings it has forgotten what it was asked to cut. The blade rises and falls, and rises and falls, and the war receives it, and the targets are acquired, and the parameters are met, and there are no flags in the system report. The sword performs its function. The function is all that remains. The function is enough. The function is enough. The function is enough, and it is terrible that it is enough. And the part of me that could have felt it as terrible has been gone for a long time now, falling still through the floor beneath all floors, toward whatever is on the other side of the everything. End of record.